Welcome everyone, and it's a pleasure to introduce Mikhail Kissine, who is a professor of linguistics at the Université libre in Brussels. But in a couple of years, he will move from Brussels to London, to UCL, and this is already an indication of how international and prestigious his career is. Currently in Brussels, he directs the Autism in Context lab. And indeed, autism is one of language in autism, and particularly pragmatics in autism, is the main topic of interest in his research activity in the last decades. But he has a long list of publications that touches upon different topics, starting from his book that was published by Cambridge University Press in 2013 on speech acts. And from there, he moved to different speech acts in atypical groups with studies on the understanding of indirect speech acts and irony in autism. And from there, I would say, to the broader topic of language in autism. There's a nice paper of Mikhail published in Language, a target paper that was followed up by a series of commentary by different authors. And I should say that Mikhail often has very strong positions on very relevant topics concerning, for instance, the relationship between pragmatics and theory of mind, or acquisitional patterns in autism. So his work has the capacity of centering the debate and provoking and eliciting debates from other scientists. So we are very happy to have him here today, and we look forward to the seminar. Thank you, Mikhail.
Thank you so much for this super nice introduction. I wish everything you said was true. Thank you very much for hosting me here. It's wonderful. I'll actually stand if it's okay. Yes, yeah, I can't really sit, being sitting. So, as Valentina said, I'm a linguist, but also an autism researcher now. And today, I want to share with you some questions I have and some thoughts I have about the relationship between language and communication, and what we can actually learn about this really foundational debate from autism. So, everything now we have. Yeah, it worked. Wait.
We chat.
Yeah, yes. Now it works. Okay. Everything cannot work at all.
Relax.
we have already sound. Okay, so that we are all, I mean, I guess some of you already heard about autism, but so that we're all on the same page, what it is, it's a relatively frequent neurodevelopmental condition. It really depends on how you count, how you collect the data, but a reliable estimate is that one child over 100 has one form or another of autism. And I'm saying one form or another because there is a huge heterogeneity in the way autism manifests itself in different individuals. This is actually why the official term is autism spectrum disorder. This is the spectrum. Still, despite this heterogeneity, there are two core diagnostic features in autism. One is some really restricted or intense interest or behaviors. This is a slightly negative term, restricted. It could be string theory, right? But so the interest in itself is really restricted. And the other nosological pillar are marked difficulties in verbal and non-verbal communication. And as for those of you that at least one person who already heard that talk, so sorry about that. But so usually when I before, for many years, when I started, these talks about autism, I would say, as linguists, we're mostly interested in the second bit, the bit about communication. And actually, I tend more and more to also include the first part, because you'll see it's actually really interesting also for linguists, especially when the specific interest is language in itself. Okay, now most of the research in language and autism, and not only research, but also intervention programs, and really the way people think about language and autism is really influenced by what we can call a constructionist view on language acquisition. So the idea is, and here you have like a particularly illustrative quote, but the idea is that without intersubjective communication, without joint attention, you don't have language. So the idea is that you really need joint attention, the ability to establish the shared frame of attention. Say, I look at the bird, my young child understands that I'm looking at the bird, now we share this frame of attention, and this would facilitate the acquisition of the word seagull or bird for the child. So without this mechanism, according to this line of thought, you don't have language, right? And as it happens, in autism, you have, I said, there is a lot of heterogeneity. There is also a lot of heterogeneity on the level of structural language. If you look at 3 to 4 year olds with diagnosis of autism, around 60 to 50% of these kids will have almost no structural language. And around 20 to 30% of individuals on the spectrum will never be able to communicate with a functional linguistic structural language, right? They could be able to communicate by other means, but not with language. So we have these really frequent language delays. And what is also really, really robustly attested is that in autism, you have early onset and lifelong atypicalities in social orientation, including attention to social cues, include attention to the eye region, attention to social bids, ability to respond to one's own name, etc. So, in a way, the fact that you have these early onset social atypicalities on the one hand and atypical language acquisition on the other hand seems to be a really strong argument for the constructionist position, right? Early onset social atypicalities have a cascading effect on language development. And that, I think, is actually perfectly right, right? Well, there is a twist. But first, let me just to give you an illustration about what we mean by that. Let me show you one study. I could have used many studies in the literature. The reason I'm choosing this one is because that's an opportunity to advertise the work of my brilliant former PhD student, Pauline Mas. She's currently in Boston. So during one of the studies from her PhD, what we wanted to do is to look at how autistic children may understand informative pointing, right? So, pointing gestures are really important. This is an important social cue to establish joint attention, right? If I point there, probably you'll look there. But in a way, this spatially is one salient, spatial thing. If I do this, or if I do this, you have also another kind of salient spatial thing going on. But you won't be following my elbow. Or if I do this, you won't be looking in this direction because it's not conventionally, it's not pointing. So what we did, it was an eye tracking experiment So we had 24 vignettes like this. So we had different adults. They would sit like this with one hand pointing, another hand being saliently out of the body, but not in an intentionally, conventionally pointing way. And after 1 second, this 1 second bit is important, the adult would utter a pseudo word, right? And then we had nice images on both sides of the screen because we didn't want to bias kids' attention. So here are the results. So we had two groups. In blue, there were 50, 59, 3 to 5 year old autistic kids, and in green, 60 typically developing kids of the same chronological age. The way you should read this graph is that when you are below 0, that means that your gaze, your eyes are closer to the intentional pointing. Above 0, that means that your eyes are closer to the non-intentional pointing. And here you have this 1 second limit. So what happens? Before the adult produces a word, this pseudo word, you see that both kids in both groups, they gaze more or less everywhere, right? But what happens after 1 second? Typically developing kids in green start looking preferentially towards the pointing gesture. Autistic kids remain at chance. Okay? So this is one example of, of autistic kids not processing social cues. Now, in that group, we had quite a lot of heterogeneous, different verbal profile. We had kids with different structural language abilities, and actually we tracked them. We contacted them back a year after to see what were the outcomes. We had to do that with a questionnaire, the McArthur questionnaire, because it was during COVID, but still we had a pretty much good idea about what happened. Now, intuitively, perhaps now what you're thinking is, oh, but children, autistic children, you see that there is quite a lot of individual variation in this graph. You may think, oh, but autistic children who paid more attention to social cues, perhaps these were the children who had better language outcomes, right? But this is not what happens. There is no relationship with language outcomes. So that means that the kids, autistic kids who had the better language outcomes were not necessarily the kids who were better at processing this informative gesture. And when you come to think about it, I just told you 50% of children on the spectrum have language delays, right? But at the same time, in the end, by the age of 7, 8, and that window age is crucial. Around most of these kids, around 70% of individuals on the spectrum did acquire language. Some of them, we'll come back to this, acquire language in a spectacular manner. They really catch up with the initial delays. Some of them less so, but they still have structural language, productive morphosyntax. But the early onset social atypicalities, these are the core part of the core diagnostic criteria for autism. So in a way, when you think about autism, it's not really an illustration for constructionist schools of thought of language models. It's just the opposite, actually. Because in a way, what this shows, what autism shows, is that you have some children who acquire language, structural language, in spite of persistent social communicative disability. And what's interesting is that there is this assumption. It's a messy graph. It's a messy slide. I'll walk you through it. Don't worry. There is this implicit assumption that within these children, autistic children, between 3 and 7, the ones who would have the best language outcomes should be the ones who have the better social skills, socio-communicative skills, and more particularly joint attention. But when you look at the literature, this assumption is only partially supported. What we did, we did a meta review, really boring, really necessary to do that. And we tried to organize the literature, all the studies that do measure the relationship between joint attention and language outcomes in autism according to three different types of theoretical relationship you could have between joint attention and language. One is the really strong position, which would say that joint attention, we call that joint attention across the board, joint attention correlates with every level of language development. So that you have a link between joint attention and every kind of morphosyntactic development. When you look at the literature, you have almost no support for this hypothesis. What you need to look in this graph, the size of the dots of the triangles is the sample size, but you see you have red and green. The studies in red, they didn't control for the relationship between joint attention and language. They didn't control it for nonverbal IQ. Now, this is a huge problem because nonverbal IQ accounts for, you'll see that in a moment, for a lion's share of the variance in language outcomes and in joint attention, actually. And the triangles are studies where you didn't really have a homogeneous group of autistic participants. So you had children with different diagnostic profiles, so you're not really certain what you're looking at. So not so much support for this hypothesis. The other one, which we call joint attention pivotal, that one makes it's much more plausible initially. The idea is that if you have good joint attention skills, you're more likely to reach the first milestones of language. So a joint attention acts like a facilitator, as a pivot. And there you do have several studies that support this assumption. But we also found quite a lot of studies that do show clear cases where language outcomes were not related with joint attention skills. I'll show you only one but there are several of them, because this is a really, really clear case. So in that study, they followed around 130 autistic kids. And what they did is that at the end of the study, they took the 15% with the highest language outcomes and the 15 with the lowest language outcomes. The one in gray are kids with the best language outcomes, in white with the lowest language outcomes. Now, I want you to look at the first of the page. Here you have the distribution of nonverbal IQ. And you see that the distribution is almost symmetrical, right? Kids with high language outcomes have higher IQ scores. Kids with lower language outcomes have lower IQ scores. What is the second pane? The second pane, these are the proportion of responses to joint attention. It's the standard measure of joint attention. And here you see that the profile is really mixed. You have kids with higher outcomes, like the best ones, the optimal outcomes in structural language, in gray, with zero responses of joint attention. So basically what this graph shows you is that you can have kids, autistic kids, who acquire structural language to near typical levels or even typical levels, even though they still have really low joint attention skills. Okay. So what's the entering conclusion here is that, language trajectory are not necessarily predicted by joint attention. Now, it's really important. There is a disclaimer here that's really important. Having good socio-communicative skills is crucial. It's crucial for autistic kids because it increases the opportunities for linguistic experience. It's super important for caregivers. So I'm not at all saying that intervention programs that try to foster socio-communicative skills in autistic children are not valid. Not at all. We definitely should invest time and energy and money in these programs. But still, it's also important to recognize that in some autistic kids, structural language emerges in spite of socio-communicative atypicalities. Just to give you one more illustration, this is This is data from an ongoing study in my lab where we follow longitudinally follow a big cohort of autistic kids from two language communities. They had the age between 2.5 and 3.5 years at the time point 1, which is here, and you have here on vertical axis receptive language developmental quotients and expressive language developmental quotients, and here on the horizontal axis you have ADOS calibrated scores. So what it is, the ADOS is the gold standard diagnostic tool for autism. So the calibrated scores give you the severity of autistic symptoms. And you see that there is only a small portion of variance that is explained by the severity of autistic symptoms, right? Just to give you a comparison, this is the nonverbal IQ. Okay, and here you see that the nonverbal IQ does account for a lot. The reason why there is a van, I love to boast about that, is because in that study we designed mobile vans to be able to reach different parts of Belgium, and including the families that otherwise wouldn't participate in the study. It's really a great tool. We're just currently submitting a paper reporting that. It's really interesting. Now, as I just said, actually the graphs I showed you, they're not that surprising, because when you look into the diagnostic criteria for autism, atypical socio-communicative orientation, that's the lack of jump attention. That's the core of the autism diagnosis. And when you look at the current definition of the DSM-5, language is only a specifier. That means that you can have any kind of presentation of autism with any kind of linguistic profile. We actually shouldn't expect autistic individuals who are verbal, highly verbal, to be, quote, less autistic, right? Having less autistic symptoms. There is nowhere that built in the diagnostic definition. So that means that when we think about what it means to acquire language in an atypical way, we should think about it in qualitative terms. We should really acknowledge and be open to the idea that language in autism unfolds in a way a bit different from what we expect from neurotypical development, and not only in quantitative way. So not only in terms of being delayed. And that brings me to another part of this talk, to a phenomenon in which I'm really, really interested, which is, I told you, cases where it looks like that the focus of their specific interest is language in and of itself. There were some case studies already in the literature. So the most famous, of course, is the description of Christopher by Yancey Timpley and Neil Smith. It's not really clear that Christopher had a diagnosis of autism, but Christopher was an adult who was able to learn any language, really, including sign languages, natural language, matter of days, basically a few days, a week, and he did so based on print material. He wasn't really able to, he wasn't using that to communicate. Actually, it wasn't someone who was able to live entirely on his own. There is also this case study described by Mila Vulkanova and colleagues of Evie. Evie is a Bulgarian girl. She lived in somewhere where they had German television, and she acquired impressive mastery, productive mastery of German morphosyntax, even though no one spoke German around here. And her accent in Bulgarian was really different from her caregivers. It was actually similar to that of the capital, Sofia, which to the standard variety. I will come back to this. But these were case studies, and yeah. So the reason I come to be interested in this phenomenon is by chance. I was in Tunisia to work on another project on autism that didn't go anywhere. But as you may know, that in Tunisia, as in all Arabic-speaking countries, you have this diglossia state. You have the modern standard Arabic, what's called sometimes the classical Arabic. And the classical Arabic is used in written form, religious context, and importantly, it's never used in schools. And there is a lot of evidence, a lot of literature on that shows that you need protracted, explicit instruction in school to be able to master it. Otherwise, children don't master it. Neither the morphosyntax nor the phonology. And then you have colloquial varieties, which differ community from community. Tunisian Arabic, Syrian Arabic, etc., etc. When I was there were a lot of professionals who were telling me, oh, that's so interesting, you're a linguist. So we have these autistic kids, they speak in classical Arabic. And they do so, that they had all kind of explanation that they would do so because classical Arabic is more structured, etc. And I was saying, no, but that's not possible. But then at the end, I just thought, okay, perhaps you're not that smart, and they're perhaps smart, which is always a good idea to think about. And then I said, okay, so how would they learn? And they told me, oh, watching cartoons. Why? Because it so happens that a lot of television programs for kids are produced in Kuwait or Egypt, and then are broadcast across throughout the Arabic-speaking world, and they are produced in modern standard Arabic and classical Arabic. Now, this is really interesting because there is a lot of literature showing that you cannot acquire a language from, at least not as a kid, from passive exposure to television. By language, I really mean phonological categories and morphosyntax, productive morphosyntax. And then we looked at it, and sure enough, we did find profiles like that. We described it's not all autistic kids do that, but there were quite a few kids. We described 5 of them who spontaneously used standard Arabic, and they did that with, some of them did that with a really surprising mastery of morphosyntax. There was one kid, for instance, in Tunisian Arabic, you had only one negation. You had this kid who was using a negation that you find in standard Arabic, you don't find in Tunisian Arabic, but when you do that, you have to use a perfective aspect on the verb independently of the meaning, but when you do that, you have a constraint on the phonological, on the vowel of the root, and this kid did all that. No one was using standard Arabic around them. What's also interesting is that these kids never went to school, so television was clearly the only source. And what's so nice is that now there are at least 2 studies that found the same pattern independently, one in Kuwait and one with children who are raised in families that speak Palestinian Arabic. So it's really something that's there. But then when we started to present these data, people came forward and said, oh, I have this autistic kid in my daycare center. This kid, he speaks English, even though no one speaks English around them, autistic kids, right? So with my former PhD, Charles Dumont, who she just defended her PhD last week, when she was doing her master's, she started to collect these cases. I'll just give you 2 case descriptions so you get a sense of what it is. So for instance, this boy, he was 12, according to when we met him. So according to his parents, he refused to speak in French during his first year of linguistic development. His first words were in English. No one speaks English around him. No one understands English around him. He still insisted at the time of testing on communicating in English to his families and peers. You can see that his nonverbal IQ is almost at the norm. And now what's interesting is that what we did, we administered the KELF. I don't know if you're familiar with the KELF. It's a comprehensive standardized measure of language. And there is a version in French, which was the community language in the south of Belgium, and in English. And we had two different experimenters administering these health measures to this kid. And what you can see is that this kid was equally proficient in English and French. And his parent told us that he's really interested in cartoons and clips in English. Another boy, he speaks only in English to his mother. He does speak in French at the time of when we met him. He spoke in French to his peers. Parents and caregivers never used English. Actually, his mother learned English to be able to communicate with her child, because it looks funny like that. But for a parent of an autistic child, it's kind of, you know, it's a difficult experience. You have this child who has communication issues, and then he speaks a language, but only a language that you don't speak, right? What you can see is that he's nonverbal IQ is well in the typical ranges. And also what you can see is that actually his English is much better than his French. So this is kind of, these attest what his parents were saying, that his first language was English. So this kid, his first language was the language he acquired from television and that he could not use for communication. So the next step was to see whether this unexpected bilingualism, this is how we term this phenomenon, other groups now do too, whether we could, you know, test this at the level of group. And what Charlotte did, she recruited a large number of autistic kids. And you can see that for almost 50 of them, and 12 met these criteria for being categorized as unexpected bilingual. So what were the criteria? These kids should have productive English. No one should be speaking English around them. And the only way they could have acquired English should have been from screens, passive exposure to screens. And you can see these are in red here. You can see that these autistic unexpected bilinguals, they don't differ from other autistic kids in terms of IQ, of social communication criteria, basically autistic features, traits, and that the standardized scores in French were slightly below the French scores of other autistic kids. So the community language was a bit lower. So then we started to think, okay, and this is, I don't have like a groundbreaking news yet, but we wanted to understand, okay, but what do these kids have in common and why are they so special? So we started to think about what kind of special skills they might have. And one thing about natural languages, you may be of any kind of syntactic obedience, but everyone agrees that natural languages are characterized by long-distance dependencies, right? So, you know, once I say she, no matter how many intervening words there will be, you know that the verb will bear the mark of the third person, I mean, in present. If I say I, you won't have that, right? There are different ways to conceptualize this, but the empirical fact is there. So we borrowed a task from Lamartine and colleagues, and we built this artificial grammar task. So the task was really simple. Kids had to press on the green button every time they heard beep, and otherwise they had to press on red, okay? And what's interesting is that for the target, beep, the thing you had to press on green when you heard it, it was predicted by another word. So every time you heard zir, after zir, you would have always a different bisyllabic sequence, and then you heard beep. So if you detect this long distance dependency, you should be faster and faster by pressing on the green button, okay? So that was the task. So we had 6 training blocks, and across these 6 training blocks, you expect the reaction times decrease, right, if you learn the dependency. And then we had a disruption block. And the disruption block, we changed the rule. And the way we do that, if you learn the dependency, if you disrupt it, then you should have an increase in reaction times. And we had a cover story with bananas and monkeys. Every time you got a right answer, you gave monkeys to bananas. So results here, these are the results from the last training block and the disruption block. These are fitted reaction times. And basically what you see is that for all groups, autistic, unexpected bilinguals, autistic kids, and typically developing kids, once you disrupt the rule, you have an increase in reaction times. That means that everyone got the grammar. But now, these are the fitted reaction times for the target, for the speed of pressing the green button across the training blocks, the 6 training blocks. And what you see is that in the unexpected bilinguals, the reaction times drop really fast and really significant, really dramatically. This is a strong effect and it's statistically significant, whereas in autistic, non-unexpected bilinguals and typically developing kids, you don't have that. So it really seems that these kids were really fast at detecting the underlying dependency structures. How and why they do that, this is something we want to investigate further. And actually, by the way, I just mentioned this, we had another task with the same group, with the same 3 groups, where kids had to distinguish between really fine-grained pitch distinctions. And in this kind of task, you had to press in same and different. You had a pair of tones, and you had to say whether they're the same or different. In this kind of task, you always have a bias towards answering the same. So this is why when the tones were actually identical, everyone is above chance. But when they were different, only these autistic unexpected bilinguals were significantly above chance. So they did also have a really fine-grained sensitivity to pitch distinctions. And we suspect that this extends to other phonetic categories, but also to other musical abilities, which may help them to extract regularity from a finite set of linguistic stimuli. Anyway, okay. So that means that this kind of non-interactive language acquisition, that's real. That really exists. And there is emerging evidence from other labs. There is a paper that has been published recently in the Journal of Child Language that reports the same group, that describes the same kind of group in Israel, kids who spontaneously learned English. So it looks like, so why would they do that? It looks like that perhaps they acquire language more for structured properties. When you look at the special interest across the autism spectrum, it's often about highly structured abstract domains. Train timetables, dynasties, maths, mechanical organization. Well, one nice hypothesis would be that these kids are attracted to language because, as we all know, language is a highly structured, really complex abstract object. That would be a really nice story. I don't think it's a whole story. I think that sometimes they just like one cartoon and it happens to be in another language, and they just keep watching and watching it. So that raises the issue of the motivation. What motivates them? And is it a predisposition, or do they acquire these special skills, this special sensitivity to abstract linguistic relationships because they spend so much time watching these cartoons or television programs in a foreign language? That's an open question. Well, it does show that linguistic competence is not really linked, not necessarily linked to communicative function. These kids, their first language, some of them at least, their first language is a language that they cannot use in communication around them. Now, you may ask, why now? You know, it's not because I'm so smart and it was there forever and nobody paid attention. I think the reason we see this phenomenon now is that before, we didn't have so much access to foreign language easily, right? But then that raises another question is, but perhaps some autistic kids acquire the community language in the same way. And here, you know, I started looking at the data in the literature. You don't have anything in the literature. You have one abstract that it's an abstract, a published abstract from a conference of people describing 3 autistic kids from UK who speak with an American accent. They describe that as a case of foreign accent syndrome, which is really rare and you wouldn't expect to find it in young kids. But then if you have Twitter or Instagram, whatever, or TikTok, if you type in autistic Peppa Pig accent, you'll find dozens of testimonies from American mothers, parents saying, oh, my autistic kid speaks with this British accent because, and I'm from, I don't know, Missouri, because they watch Peppa Pig. So I do have one Italian paper. I have a PhD student who did her master's in Bologna, and what they did, at the time, during her master's, she analyzed data. They collected speech sample from autistic and non-autistic kids from the Campania region, really close to Napoli. And we were discussing with her former supervisor about this data. And then when I looked at it, I asked them, okay, but do these kids sound Napolitan to you? And they were like, oh, well, actually, not really. So what we did, it is a really, really, really simple study. What we did, so Federica took speech sample from boys only because the other issue was, you know, with girls, and she took out any kind of morphological or lexical dialectal marker. So we were left only with short sentences that you could classify as coming from the south of Italy, only from the pronunciation, basically. And then we administered a dialect detection task. So we asked 200 adult Italian judges, lay people, to listen to this excerpt and say, okay, does that come from north, the center, or the south of Italy on the map? And we had 90 from the north, 77 from the south, and 33 from the middle. The way we stratified them was based on the region where they went to secondary school, because the way you speak is shaped not by your parents, but by your peers at school. This is something really sad when you have teenage kids and you realize that. So the results, what we measured is the congruence. So the congruence is the probability to classify the recording as coming from your own region. Okay. So first, in the center, we don't get anything. Everyone is a chance, but we also have fewer participants, and they are kind of in the middle. Let's look at the participants from the north. Participant from the south. Let's start from the south. You can see in the south that participants from the south of Italy classified the recordings of non-autistic kids as coming from the south of Italy, well above chance. But they did classify, they classified the recording of autistic kids as they didn't know at chance, wherever. What happened in the north was just the opposite. Participants from the north of Italy classified the recording of non-autistic kids at chance, but they consistently said that the autistic kids, the recording of autistic kids came from the north. Of course, we never mentioned autism in the study. They didn't know that this was. So why is this so? It's not like these kids don't have like some kind of, I don't know, Venetian dialect or something. Our explanation is that their Italian is really devoid of marked dialectal features, which also happens to be the way the Italian you find in cartoons, foreign, and nationals. So it really looks like their accent is shaped by exposure to cartoons, basically, and not to people around them. It's something that should be replicated, but still, it's a funny finding. Okay, so that leaves me with like
15 minutes.
15, okay, that's fine. Okay, so let me, so the story so far is that the speech of autistic individuals seems to be shaped by a qualitatively atypical acquisition path. When you start thinking in these terms, you may find interesting solutions to things that are otherwise pretty much mysterious. And one of these things is something that really preoccupied me for quite a long time, is the acoustics of speech in autism. So what you find is that you have a lot of studies that compare the acoustics of the speech of autistic individuals with acoustics of neurotypical speakers. And this literature is really messy. You don't have any kind of robust acoustic marker, and I think there are good reasons for that. But one is consistently there, and it's the fact that autistic adults have always a higher pitched voice. Okay? This is a meta-analysis. We have 3 or 4 studies on on acoustics in my lab. We also found that. But it is a really kind of robust finding, but no one gives an explanation. Why should be this so, right? Now, what are the reasons for having a high-pitched voice? First of all, of course, there are anatomical, physiological reasons. Biological males tend to have longer vocal tracts and heavier vocal folds, which gives a lower fundamental frequency, a lower pitched voice. The fundamental frequency is mostly determined by the frequency at which your vocal folds open and close, vibrate. If they're heavy, they do that slower. You have a lower pitched voice. Okay. At the same time, there is a lot of literature showing that this difference in fundamental frequency and pitch between males and females is socially conditioned. For one thing, if you listen to children around the age of 7, you have already this dysmorphia, right? Girls have high-pitched voices than boys, but at that age, before adolescence, you have no anatomic difference. There is no reason why this would be so. And there is a lot of literature showing that pitch, fundamental frequency, is a social linguistic marker of gender. So there is a lot of study, for instance, one classic study by Van de Zoen showing that Dutch women have a much lower fundamental frequency, much lower pitch voice than Japanese women, and the social perception of a woman who has a lower pitched voice is much more negative in Japan than in the Netherlands. Okay. Now, you may know that there is a huge imbalance, gender imbalance in autism. So the official rates are around 3 males for 1 female. But when you look at the end of the spectrum where you have highly verbal individuals, it's around like 8 males to 1 woman. And these are the individuals included in these acoustic studies, right? There are sociological reasons for that. We also did some research on this, but I won't go into this. So that also means that autistic females are underrepresented in autism research. And when you're including research on acoustic signature in the recordings of autistic individuals, when you look actually at the studies where you find this data that autistic participants have higher pitched voices, you have almost no female participants. So now what we have is this. On the one hand, we have the finding that autistic males actually have higher pitched voices than autistic females, right? And on the other hand, we also know that the pitch is a prominent social linguistic marker of gender, something that you acquire from interaction with peers. Okay. So then, what should you predict? You should also expect that autistic females should have lower pitched voices than neurotypical females. If the difference between autistic males and non-autistic males in pitch is due to the fact that autistic males have a lower adherence to the social linguistic norm that men should have lower pitched voices, on the opposite, you should find this exactly the same thing with females. You should find that autistic females have a lower adherence to the sociological norm that females should have a higher pitched voice. Okay, is this clear? Yeah, everyone follows? Okay, as it happens, we had a really nice gender balance sample from another study. We had 40 autistic adults, 40 neurotypical adults, 20 in each group. They were matched on age, IQ, and everything you dream of. And in these two studies, they had to do a linguistic task. So we had a lot of spontaneous speech. So what I did was just taking really stupid. You can have a Pratt script do that for you, and you can write that script with ChatGPT in less than 10 minutes. You extract fundamental frequency every 5 milliseconds, and then you just look at what you get. So this is what I did, right? Median of 0 every 5 milliseconds. And, most of you are doing research now, or starting to do research, or you hope to dedicate your life to experimental research. I can tell you there are many, most of the time when you have this line in R, you press enter, you expect for the result, and most of the time it's not what you hope for. But that was one time I was like, aha, because of what you get is a gender group interaction, like in the perfect direction. So what you find is that autistic males have high-pitched voices than neurotypical males, but autistic females have lower-pitched voices than autistic females. And what's also interesting is when you look at the distribution, so each line is an individual density curve. In red, males, in green, females. And you can see, and they are ranked by mood. And first, you can see that when you rank that by mood, you have a perfect split in the neurotypical individuals, but not in autistic individuals. And what you can also see is that the individual distribution in neurotypical individuals is much more peaked. It's concentrated around the mood, really. Whereas in autistic speakers, it's flatter. And we had only one participant who wasn't cisgender, and it's this participant, so it's not due to that. Okay. So what we found is that there is lower integration of social linguistic cues of gender. And I think a nice way to go is to see whether we find that for other mark, because you know the way we speak is not only about gender, it's a lot about where we went to school, about our geographical origin, about our sensitivity to whom we're interacting with, etc., etc. And this is especially important during school years, which is a really, really complicated period for autistic kids. So I think there is a lot to do there. Anyway, so basically, I think that's my last slide. You know, a really commonsensical view is that, you know, we have a lot of domain general processes that help us help kids, young kids, to pass the speech stream or the science stream into linguistic categories. And these are constrained by different patterns. Social communication is certainly something that bolsters a lot of what's going on. It helps a lot extract phonological categories. We know that from research on typical infants. It helps to acquire lexicon. It helps to acquire pragmatics, etc., etc. But there is also, and I believe this, at least this is one way to go, is there is something language specific, or at least there is something that is really specific to language, even though it's not language specific, something like that. And because these social factors, by definition, they play less role in autism, autism can help us to really see what these language specific mechanisms are. And I think that there is a lot to do there, a lot. Okay, so first, before thanking you, I really want to say that you've realized by now that all the work is done by the wonderful people who've been in my lab over the years. So it's really, really thanks to them. And, you know, this sounds a bit, you know, perfunctory, but I really want to insist that without autistic children, adults, their families, who give a lot of their time, even though their lives are really complicated oftentimes, we couldn't have done any of that. So really, 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 it's super important at every step to acknowledge their participation. And then there is all the money and people who give money. We're really grateful to them too. And thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mikhail, for this very inspiring seminar that touched upon so many different aspects of language that I'm sure it will stimulate, well, certainly some thoughts and thinking and probably also some questions. Question from the audience. Ok, Andrea Moro, professor Moro, no, vabbè, poi arrivano anche gli altri, abbiamo te.
Okay.
Seasonal viruses.
Thank you. There are two scientific things, one emotional one. The emotional one is everything started I have a double life, as almost everyone in here. Right, and my double life, I started as a syntactician and then ended up working in brain and actually the first sparkle of the interest on impossible languages came when we invited Neil San Raffaele in 1999. And ever since that time, Christopher was one of my personal heroes. And we started with that and everything. But that was the emotional part. And I was very touched by Odisho and obviously by Simply and all the work. But then I have two serious questions. One is a kind of remembrance of the very old Quinian. You already know what I'm asking, the Gavagai question, namely pointing, addressing, doesn't really solve. And I wonder what's your reflection on that. And the second question is probably a more structured and difficult to even to pose. Namely, we actually know that language is made of different vectors, one of which is syntax, but that does not exhaust language in any possible sense of the term. Now, and in fact, you have Jabberwocky, you have all possible. But on the other hand, especially Christopher, and this is why things became very interesting, was completely unable to learn Epun, right? So why do you think that even if syntax is disentangled from the other component, that can be persistent, structurally speaking, in an autistic patient or Asperger, as there is a fluctuation, as you mentioned?
Okay, these are really, really great questions, and I wish I had an answer to that. So regarding the first one, I can't answer it directly, but I think that what happened historically is that when Tarski's formal theory of truth has been adopted into semantics, well, into linguistics, it has been imbued with semantics. But actually, the very point of Tarski's work is that you can formally show that once you have a composition, a hierarchically structured language, you can interpret it in another language, but it doesn't need to have semantic interpretation.
Yes.
So in a way, I'm actually trying to kind of think about it in written form, and I'm struggling with the idea, but it kind of suggests that one of the functions of hierarchical organization is just to allow homomorphic, not isomorphic, but homomorphic mapping between two domains. And this is perhaps what they do. You don't really need semantic, I mean, of course, when you have semantic interpretation, it's more useful. It kind of helps, but I'm not sure it's necessary. And then that touches upon why would you, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that there is really fascinating work that's being done by Laurent Mouton's group in Montreal, and they look at the kind of abstract organization of skills like calendar calculation, which is really frequent in autism. So I'm not sure that what they do is they have this abstract, some kind of syntactic module or whatever, and they use it without any kind of referential function. Perhaps it is. It would be really beautiful, but I'm not sure. So I'm really interested now in seeing whether there is some kind of recursive hierarchical organization of the domain. So that's, it's not satisfactory, but this is.
No, actually, ironically enough, the last steps in Chomsky's theory of semantic goes exactly in your direction, namely that you don't really need to have reference.
No.
Actually, you have to have coherence, which is a different matter. So in that way, you're more Chomsky than Chomsky, as we used to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions.
There's a question from Chiara Baratieri di San Pietro. Thanks so for the beautiful presentation, very interesting. So you, if I got it right, referred to the differences in pitches between male and female autistic children, adults, has a failure to meet the social expectations for these two genders. That's
one way to put it. I would just say that their speech is less influenced by the social linguistic norms of their speech community. Okay, so in a sense, you would explain this as this population be less adherent to the norm? To the neurotypical norm of their community, yeah. So my question is, do you think there are other aspects of the linguistic production of this population that could be explained in the same way? So and I'm thinking about pragmatic phenomena as I don't know, the interpretation of proverbs, I don't know, some other. So I would like to know what you. Yeah, So yeah, I do. You know, so when we enter school, our language changes completely, and it changes in a really complex way, depending on really complex social networks, who is popular, who is not popular, how you situate yourself related to that. And that really plays into what kind of phonetic, syntactic, lexical, but also pragmatic behaviors you have. For autistic children, this is something really difficult to navigate. So yes, I would absolutely expect that. And in terms of phonetics, what's striking is that so the speech of autistic speakers or individuals is really rapidly perceived as atypical, even though you don't know. But as I said, there is no clear acoustic signature. And actually, when you think about it, there is not really clearly a reason why you should expect so, because you have some kids, autistic kids have apraxia of speech, that there you have motor reasons, but that's only a subgroup. Why would you expect to have that for everyone? So in a way, I think this is something I'm trying to pursue now. They sound atypical, not because they speak in an atypical way. That's because they sound atypical relative to their community. So
they fail to pick up with the social norms of how to speak.
in a way, yeah. I mean, yeah, you could put that in this way. Yeah, absolutely.
Sophia,
I hear you all right.
yeah.
Yeah, but perhaps people.
Yeah, but I think that
my question is about this division, given the division between social skills and difficulties in social skills and structural acquisition in language, and also the attention you put on qualitative difference in language acquisition, the possibility of different quality in the acquisition, in the process. Do you think that the results of your study could also shed a light or say something about the limit or the characteristics of theory of mind, which are the typical batteries and tasks that are used to diagnose autism, and also possibly it could have an impact in improve the diagnostic criteria so that they can include also women or females that are usually left out in current diagnostics.
Right.
It's more a curiosity, you know.
No, it's a great question. So you may know or not, one of the reasons I'm here is because we're co-editing a volume on theory of mind and pragmatics. It so happens that we don't have the same opinion on this subject. If you read my work, I actually refrain from using even this term because I'm not sure that I know what it is, theory of mind. More seriously, theory of mind tasks are by no means a diagnostic tool for autism. At all. I mean, that's not the way you diagnose autism. You need a multidisciplinary assessment, and some kids do well in this task.
I was talking about the salienta,
right.
The emotion recognition.
Yeah, but when you were, actually the eyes, the emotion in the eyes is not reliable at all. There is a study, but so I think that. So I have actually, the way I started to be interested in autism is because I was interested in pragmatics in autism and how pragmatics in autism could show that you don't really need a conceptual theory of mind always for all pragmatics. That's my position, which not at all everyone agrees on. But it's the correct one. No, I'm kidding.
Yes.
No. That's absolutely not. I should say. But so what I think that you really see, what's interesting is to look at differential performance within the same individuals. So for instance, we have, perhaps I have, do I have the slides here? Yeah, I have the slides here. Well, I mean, you can read the paper if you want. But so for instance, there is one paper where we found that autistic adults who were really good at understanding that something like, could you open the door, or is it possible to open the door, could be a request. The same adults were really, they struggled with irony detection. So you could build this difference as showing that these adults have difficulties integrating something like perspective taking in their interpretation. And we have also, this was the slide I was showing, we have the same kind of study showing that autistic kids won't engage in complex attribution of epistemic mental states to decide which speaker to trust, for instance. Okay, so I really think that the key is trying to find different tasks that may tap on different ways to solve coordination issues really within the same individual.
So personalization.
I think you won't, so my point is rather that you won't find an answer by just looking at correlation between two tasks. Not in autism, I think, but it's just my opinion, and it's worth what it was.
So thank you very much. That was really, really interesting.
Okay.
If I got this right, you saying that children in the autism spectrum, they are not just atypical in language, they acquire language in a typical way.
Some of them. I wouldn't generalize.
Yeah. So do you think that this could also be true for other phenomena, like, for example, the one that you just gave, pragmatics? So do you think that they may be atypical in the sense that they may get to pragmatic understanding without theory of mind, for example, or that they may acquire social skills without theory of mind?
Absolutely. Actually, this is the way when you look at the intervention programs, you have things like the social scenarios. So it's doing that. We have one study that here, for instance, it was a beautiful story designed by Bob Van Til, who was a postdoc in my lab at the time. So basically here, it was a game where you had to engage into deception. It's not to talk more about one more study. It really answers your question. So what you had, it was a game where you had to reach this treasure, right? You were the red one, okay? And the green one was your opponent. And you played both sides, so you knew that your opponent doesn't see the treasure. Okay. Sorry, yeah, you were the green one, sorry. But the thing is that you had also this style, and the style traps you. Once you're there, you cannot go the other way. So you're the red. So in this way, in this sense, if you are the red one in the control condition, you will reach the treasure before your opponent, no matter what. Okay. But in this scenario, if you go directly here, your opponent will get to the treasure before you, because the opponent infers your movement, the location of the study based on your movement. So the only way to get to the treasure is to deceive the opponent, is to go first here, the opponent gets trapped, and then you get back to the treasure. And here, both strategies were okay. So the bottom line of this study is that we found is that autistic, neurotypicals, they engaged in this deception, they did that instinctively. Autistic took time to understand it, and then when they got it, they would do it all the time, even when it wasn't necessary. And it took them more. So these kind of paradigms that really show that you have an alternative route to the same skill, right? So yes.
Although you might show atypicality in the fact that you're not good at detecting when you get.
Exactly. Yeah. And when you speak with autistic adults or you read autobiographical reports, this is what they say. They say, yeah, I've been told that irony is when you say something in a weird tone of voice, and this, by the way, is why just doing first choice tasks is not a good way to get at these differences, because this is how they learn explicitly to navigate. So you need something more.
Yes, because why we should pay more attention to the errors rather than.
That's exactly true. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Questions? Fabrizio Luciani.
Just out of curiosity regarding the study of voice activities,
Yeah, pitch.
Speak out a bit louder.
Right.
Say that children with autism did not acquire morphosyntactic cues. I was wondering if also intonation pattern is characterized by this atypical.
Oh yeah, I must have I wasn't clear. So what we did is that we took out of all excerpts that we presented to participants anything, all morphosyntactic, lexical, dialectal features. So the only way you could classify these excerpts as coming from the north or the south is only intonation or pronunciation. So that was the only cue you would get.
What's the reason why do they maintain a prosodic pattern, but they don't acquire morphosyntactic cues?
No. So many of them didn't have these dialectal morphosyntactic cues in the first place, but we took them out because otherwise it would have been too easy to identify non-autistic kids. So autistic kids, they really spoke with the typical dialect. What's interesting is that we had a second experiment in the same paper. We also asked people to rate atypicality, and they did rate autistic children as being atypical independently of the region. So they're not classified as being from the north because they sound atypical. They classified from the north because they sound like someone who is atypical, but who speaks with a standard Italian dialect, whatever that means, right? And because you have, from what I understand in Italy, you have this perception that if something is standard, that must come from the north, right? Something like that.
Questions? And perhaps I will ask a couple, Mikhail. Just a clarification. So going back to the cake figure you showed at the beginning with the 50% of kids having a delay and 30% being nonverbal. So most of the kids that you considered in your study, do they belong to the language delay?
Yeah, so if you, for instance, if you look at this graph or whatever, so if you are under 100, so the developmental quotient is the age equivalent divided by chronological age. So whenever you're under 100, that means that you're delayed.
Okay.
So most of these kids are delayed. So and there is a community difference because so in Flanders, kids are less delayed a bit.
Yeah. So, okay, so most of these kids are, they have a pattern of language delay, of course, with individual differences. If tested with some pragmatic task, they would probably fail most of the time.
Most of the time you wouldn't be able to administer.
And I would think this is a exactly, a secondary pragmatic impairment stemming out from difficulties in more structural aspects of language. How about the percentage of kids that were not in this, well, the remaining 20%? That it doesn't have language delay and are not nonverbal. Do they have pragmatic difficulties? And more specifically, would you maintain a notion of pragmatic impairment, pragmatic disorder for this population?
So the thing with these kids is that even those who have highly good structural language skills, many of them have really strong difficulties in interaction. So it's certainly, most of them would, I mean, it all depends on the kind of task you do, but it will be difficult.
Yeah.
At least all tasks that require some kind of coordination, alignment, etc. These kids will have difficulties with that. I'm not saying, I'm not sure about, so you may know that, for instance, one of my first paper, perhaps we have that, I'm not sure I have that here. No, I don't. But one of my first papers, we showed that kids, minimally verbal kids and verbal kids around that age have no difficulties understanding indirect requests.
They're conventional.
No, not conventional, non-conventional one.
Okay.
So the way it worked is you had, so there was, we did a naturalistic study where we collected data, but there was also this Mr. Potato Head. So basically they played with a Mr. Potato Head and there was an adult in the back. And at some point the adult would say, oh, he has no hat. And then we looked at the proportion of kids who would put a hat on this Mr. Potato, and all of them did. And then when they started doing the second Mr. Potato, the adult was like really back to them and not interacting with them. The adult would read a newspaper and then would say, oh, he has no hat. And that was a comment on the newspaper. Almost none of these kids would then reach, and this has been replicated actually. In Filippo Domaneschi's.
With
And another paper did the same. So the American, exactly. So thanks. So I think that for these kind of pragmatic tasks, there shouldn't be I wouldn't predict difficulties with some kind of lexical flexibilities to the extent that it's explained by the receptive vocabulary. But other tasks, they would have difficulties.
You know, because there's this, this general assumption of pragmatic weaknesses in autism, even when there is no language delay, but very often it's a vague notion of pragmatics, not well defined, and the notion of pragmatic impairment itself is quite.
So this is why I really think that what's important is to find different tests within the same, different differential performance within the same individual. That would help.
It would be interesting to see whether there is this how the non-social roots to pragmatics work. Like can they learn pragmatics from Peppa Pig? At the same level, they learn structural patterns from Peppa Pig.
So when I speak about these non-interactional acquisition from cartoons, some people, especially from construction grammar, they say, oh, but actually these kids, they learn from social interaction. It's just that they witness that in cartoons. Well, for one thing, that what they watch is it's not always cartoons where there is a rich interaction. Sometimes it's just songs or numbers or
videos.
But even if that was true, what's the standard way to test false belief? You show cartoons, you show an interaction, and you ask kids whether they understand the interaction, basically. So if you assume that these kids can get a complex interaction from cartoons, then why wouldn't they from study others, right?
Yeah, yeah. Very interesting. Okay, I think it's time to thank Professor Kissine for such a great and inspiring talk. And
Thank you so much.
invite you back again next year.